Welcome to session 6 in Made for More. I hope that this has been, as it has been for me, a rich time of discovery, of identifying values and dreams and purpose and getting our faith built about just how much God can use anything that He's put in your hand. And I want to, in our closing session together, say that sometimes the best time to sow good seed is smack dab in the middle of a hard time, in the middle of a famine. It sure worked out for a Hebrew patriarch named Isaac. So throughout this whole Made for More series, we've referred a lot to this principle of the seed. Whole design of the world hinges on the seed principle. A small seed containing all the life that is needed to sprout into a plant that will bear fruit that matches the seed. Everything is designed to reproduce, and to reproduce by multiplication, not just addition. God wants us to think about the exponential, generational nature of blessing, like a farmer thinks about seed. So in our opening session, I started with an example that what happens if a penny doubles in value every day for a month. So here's another example. Have you ever tried folding a piece of paper in half as many times as you can? Well, maybe not, but you just take a piece of paper and fold it, and you can fold it once, twice, fold it over third time, and maybe you can fold it 4 times. And if you start working at it, maybe you can fold it 5 times. After that, you can't really fold a piece of paper that much. But what if you could? What if you could fold a piece of paper, if you had one that was big enough and you could fold it up as much as 42 times? How high would that go? Just guess. If you guessed anything less than the moon, you missed it. If you take a piece of paper and fold it 42 times, it reaches the moon. I'm saying this is the way God thinks about blessedness when He defined Himself as Yahweh, the Lord, who shows loving kindness, chesed, to 1,000 generations, unfailing covenantal love to 1,000 generation after generation, blessing that grows exponentially. What we start with might be small, and we mustn't let our feelings of smallness keep us from investing our lives. I heard about a farmer who was at a church when a missionary spoke, and the farmer was deeply moved by this missionary who he knew personally. And afterwards, the farmer came to the missionary and said, wow, I love what you're doing. I love your ministry. What an important ministry. I was so moved. And the farmer said, I wish I had 2 houses, because if I did, I'd give you 1. I wish I had 2 cars, because if I did, I'd give you 1. The farmer said, I wish I had 2 airplane tickets, because if I did, I'd give you 1. The missionary, who knew the farmer, said, so what if you had 2 pigs? The farmer responded, hey, that's not fair. You know I have 2 pigs. Well, I want to show you a story in the Old Testament that's remarkable about sowing and reaping, but it's not a story about someone's financial decision, though there's a lot of principles for us to consider about generosity. But it's a story that highlights big kingdom principle that has to do with all of life. It's a story about Isaac, Abraham's only son, the second patriarch of Israel, the father of Jacob and Esau. Genesis 26:1. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. A famine. Literally, it's when the ground gets dry. Nothing seems to grow. Things get scarce. People grow hungry. And you begin to wonder what's next and how you're going to make it. Famines and wildernesses appear in the biblical narratives as symbols of those times in life when you have to trust in God in a deeper, more radical way. In the famine time, you can't fix things, you can't finance them, and you can't fake it. The famine seasons of life strip us down to what we need most. In Genesis 12, we're told there was a famine also in Abram's day, and he went down to Egypt. That's what people did during Joseph's time. People had to go down to Egypt to get food. So Isaac's thinking, I better pack up, head to Egypt. But the Lord had a different plan. Genesis 26:2. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I tell you. Stay here, Isaac. Stay here during the famine. And then God reaffirms the promises made to Isaac's father, Abraham. Genesis 26:3. Sojourn in this land, and I'll be with you, will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I'll multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. It's easy to sow a little seed when everything seems easy and you've got a lot of seed. Everybody's sowing and reaping during those lush times of plenty. But this is a hard thing to consider, sowing during a famine. I'm sure that someone, maybe participating right now, you're going through a tough time. We all go through such times. Maybe it's a time of emotional or physical or even spiritual type of famine. I've been there. Maybe it's a relationship and it feels like the love has dried up. Or maybe it's a vocation and it seems like the opportunities have dried up. Or maybe it's a spiritual calling and it feels like the power's dried up. Famine is the time when there just seems to be no real fruit. I've been in times in ministry where the fruit is just falling off the trees. It feels like it's splatting me in the face every day. Church growing, flourishing, people coming to Christ, spiritual breakthroughs, healings of all sorts, fruit, fruit, fruit. But I've also been in seasons of ministry when it felt like a famine, like you're scratching at the ground and it's hardly breaking the soil, and you're wondering what's going on, and is it all worth it to sow your time and energy into that kind of field? And I'm just saying, when you come into a famine, the first response is usually like Isaac's. It's like, I just feel like I need to be somewhere else. I need to go somewhere else. And if it's not, there's maybe no joy in life, or maybe there's no intimacy in a marriage, or the tempter comes and basically says, you need to go somewhere else. I mean, it can be any of us. It could be a preacher who gets into a church and things are a honeymoon for a year, and then the third year he meets opposition and he's like, well, call U-Haul, time to go somewhere else. Maybe I have another honeymoon period. If two people are in the same famine and they look to each other and it's like, I'm all out, what do you have? And I'm all out, what do you have? And it says, a mentor once called me, said it becomes a couple, it's like two ticks, no dog, draining the life out of one another. And if you can't find somewhere else to go or someone else to feed you, you can make this hellish conclusion during a famine: I'm just unblessed, and the promises of God aren't true. Famine will do that to you, make you question things you've counted on. So Isaac was headed to Egypt, but the Lord said, and everything changes on those words. It hinges on that. The Lord said, his word intervened, spoken to the famine. Notice God didn't fix the famine before he spoke to Isaac. The famine remained, but Isaac was redirected. It's the first and most important thing we need to know about these famine times, is there will be a word from the Lord. It'll come. And God addressed these temptations that we have in these famine times. He said, do not go to Egypt. The answer is not to avoid the challenge. Scott Peck, the famous author of The Road Less Traveled, began his book with these words: life is difficult. And he continued by explaining that almost all psychological disorders, in one way or another, are the result of us trying to go around a problem rather than through it. There are, of course, times that the Lord leads us to new places, but it's not usually to avoid a difficult thing. Instead, God gives us strength and courage to do difficult things in hard, famine-like places. But God says, I'll be with you. I'm in the famine with you. You can't flee his presence, the psalmist said. If I rise on the wings of the dawn and travel to the uttermost parts of the sea, you're there. Or in another psalm, Psalm 73, the priest says, whom have I in heaven but you? My flesh and my heart might fail, but you are my portion forever. The portion, the Lord was their provider. God says, I will bless you. You can be blessed in the middle of this famine. You don't need easier circumstances in order for me to bless you, God says. I am your blessing. So Isaac stays, Genesis 26:12. And Isaac sowed in that land. And I want you to imagine it. Everybody's hunkered down, holding on to the little grain that they've got. No one is planting anything in the dry dirt. Who wants to lose the little they have? And then they see old Isaac browsing the marketplace, looking at the few vendors there, notices the bits of withered fruit for sale, the craftsmen with their wares, past the bakery where they assume he's come to maybe buy a piece of bread. But Isaac goes past all those vendors, can you imagine it? And approaches the loneliest man in the marketplace, the man who's selling the seed. No one's buying seed. No one's sowing in a famine. They look at Isaac like he's a fool. Give me your best seed, and plenty of it, I imagine Isaac saying. And while everyone thinks him the fool, the way they must have thought Noah was an idiot for building a big boat under sunny skies, Isaac tills his crusty field and he sows. And something happened. We're not told what. Perhaps the rain came. Perhaps he found a way to irrigate. Maybe God just gave him a miracle. But Genesis 26:12, Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him. And the man became rich and gained more and more, and he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so the Philistines envied him. Isaac became wealthy because he was the only one who had anything growing. He was the only one who had grass for livestock to eat, the only one with grain to sell. To him who has much, more is given. So Isaac became rich. His famine became his feast. It's just a marvelous story that illustrates something really powerful, and I think it's a fitting way to end this series. When you feel most like giving up, is probably the absolutely best time to start. You were made for more. You're made for more than this temporary famine you might be facing. You were made for more than just holding on to a little bit of grain. You're made to be a blessing that multiplies and multiplies. Your whole life is like a seed. And you can have confidence and hope and strength and be sure that God is with you, because God, in the fullness of time, sent His Son. Like sowing the most precious seed imaginable into the hard ground of a sin-broken world, Jesus was the seed sown into the famine of human sin, so that you and I would be the fruit. Jesus came because you are made for more. I hope that you have loved learning about all of these principles, but I hope even more so that God has begun giving you clarity about your values, your 100-year dream, your vision, and building your faith that whatever is in hand, He can use that. And maybe most of all, that when you go through the difficult times, that's not the time to give up. It really is the time to trust God all the more. Maybe even so in a famine.